Let's bring in Peter Baker, MSNBC political analyst, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, and co-author of The Divider, Trump in the White House, 2017 to 2021. Welcome, my friend. Checking out your new article, Peter, you write this issue would come to a head during that bilateral meeting. Did it, and what is the calculus around allowing Ukraine to use the long-range weapons? I mean, is there an obvious strategic purpose, advantage to it?
Yeah, there's a real debate going on right now about this in the West and in Washington in particular. If you ask the Defense Department, what they will say is they don't think it's a good idea to allow Ukrainians to use these ATACMS. That's what they call these long-range weapons, in part because they say 90% of the air bases that we're talking about in Russia that are mounting these attacks on Russia are outside of the range of those weapons anyway. And therefore, on the one hand, it wouldn't do as much good as people hoped it would do. And on the other, there's a worry, obviously, and President Biden has, nursed this worry, I think, for more than 2 years of escalation. And that's why he has sort of slow rolled at times the provision of certain weapons, worrying that if he gave Ukraine this weapon or that weapon, it would escalate with Russia to the point that things would get to where Vladimir Putin is talking about, that he would be at war with NATO, that it could even escalate into a nuclear conflict. So that's been his concern all along. At the same time, he ultimately ends up providing many of these weapons anyway. The difference here is they're not weapons for use on Ukrainian territory. What the Ukrainians want is to be able to use them against Russian territory. And the worry is that's a red line for Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. So give me a sense of the U.S.'s goal, Peter. Does it seem that escalating is the only path being considered, or are there legit de-escalation paths in sight too?
Well, I mean, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has talked about having a peace conference of some sort in November, that he wants to have a plan that he'll present at the UN. But it doesn't seem like there's a fertile territory right now for a negotiated solution. For one thing, there's no understanding that Vladimir Putin is either interested in a negotiated solution or would abide by one, even if he did, sign something. Remember, he's signed ceasefires in Ukraine before, prior to the big invasion. Remember, this started in 2014 and not always lived up to that. So Putin's word is not that good, obviously, in the West, certainly in Ukraine. But there's, a lot of exhaustion with the war. Imagine in Ukraine, 2.5 years of war, tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians killed, if not many more than that. I don't have the latest estimate. And so obviously you can see why there might be a desire for it. But on Putin's part, he sees no reason, I think, to do anything until November, waits to see what the presidential election will be. If he gets Donald Trump back in there, it's a whole different ballgame from his point of view.
Okay, let's talk about what happened during the celebration of Black excellence in that brunch at the White House yesterday. President Biden slammed Trump for his repeated lies about Haitian immigrants in Ohio eating pets. And yet, on the other side of the country, the former president doubled down on related remarks during a press conference in California. Let's all take a listen to this, everyone.
We will do large deportations from Springfield, Ohio. Large deportations. We're going to get these people out. It's like an invasion from within. And we're going to have the largest deportation in the history of our country.
Simply wrong. There's no place in America. This has to stop what he's doing. It has to stop.
President Biden has not said much about Trump since leaving the race, other than, campaign speeches for Vice President Harris. But of all the childish things or outlandish things, or however you want to categorize it, that Trump has said recently, what do you think prompted the president to address this crazy claim at this event?
Well, look, I think this one kind of broke through in a way into the larger culture. The notion that dogs and cats were being eaten in Springfield, Ohio, as we just heard from that previous report, was far-fetched to begin with, and obviously now has been debunked. And the fact that the former president would propagate that on national television, kind of, I think, had a larger cultural moment than many of the anti-immigrant speeches he makes. So I think, you heard the president address this. Remember, President Biden was following Karine Jean-Pierre, his White House press secretary, who spoke a few minutes earlier and noted that she herself is Haitian American. It's also important to remember when the former president talks about mass deportations in Springfield, many, if not most of these immigrants are here legally through a program under President George W. Bush allowing, immigrants from certain countries of great distress to stay in the country and work legally. So it's not that most of these people are here illegally. It doesn't mean there's not stress on the system in Springfield. That obviously is a concern when you have a small town suddenly having a large influx of people from anywhere. There's stress on services and so forth. But the way that former President Trump depicts it makes it very dystopian, and of course distorts the picture when he says things about dogs being eaten, and it implies that these people are here all illegally.
Yeah. So let's talk about Donald Trump, who said there will be no more debates with Vice President Harris, but his former White House communications director is not buying it. Take a listen.
It's 100% that he's going to debate. I'll make that prediction here. He knows he lost the debate, and he knows he's debating her again, but he has to have a build-up. He thinks it's a negotiating chip. He's trying to show his macho flex.
So despite all the no-no-nos not happening, last night Trump kind of slightly wavered on the issue, saying he would debate Harris again if he got in the right mood. Is Anthony Scaramucci right, do you think? Can Trump really resist the challenge, or will potential fear of a second loss keep him from doing another one? Is there, Peter, any evidence he even sees Tuesday's debate as a loss?
Well, the people around him understand that it was, and I think that's obviously going to factor into the equation. I think one thing and I think Scaramucci is making this point, was that Donald Trump loves a suspenseful show. He loves a cliffhanger. 14 seasons on air with The Apprentice. He had to make people come back for more. So he says, no, no, no. And he says, well, maybe, no, yes, only if. So, it looks like he's trying to begin that, game which he's played in the past, where he strings people along for a while, keeps them guessing, and tries to impose conditions that he thinks might be advantageous to him. But look, he has a reason to debate again if he wants to, because in fact, most people do perceive that he lost that debate, rightly or wrongly. That's what the flash polls show. That's what certainly the pundits have been saying, including Republicans and allies of his. So when you've lost a debate, you have an interest in getting back on the debate stage to kind of recover. We've seen that with past, cycles. When Barack Obama lost the first to Mitt Romney, he wanted to get back on stage and so on. So it's very possible he'll have another debate.
But what if he lost? I'll leave that rhetorically. We'll see if it even happens, then we'll discuss it. Thank you so much, Peter. Good to see you.